Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Nichols, and I'm a 2011 Nuffield Scholar without a... I'd just like to start off by thanking Nuffield for having the confidence in me to deliver this report. It was my topic of interest, which is renewable energy as an alternative farm income, is slightly off the usual spectrum of the research work that is done in the Nuffield organisation, so I do thank them for giving me this opportunity. It's been a great privilege. And also particularly I'd like to thank Riddick as the sponsors for me for what has been an absolutely amazing year for me. The Global Focus Programme, well, we've heard everybody claim that their Global Focus Programme was the best one that there was and that they had the best group of people to travel with, but let me assure you that they weren't on our trip, otherwise you'd realise what a really good group it was. We had a fantastic group of amazing guys around here with us. Part of these experiences allowed us to play cricket in the streets in India with all the street kids there. I'm pretty damn sure that most of them thought that we were really the Australian cricket team with the green hats on our heads. And one of them was pretty handy with the ball and was called Adam, so I think they all thought that probably his surname was Gilchrist. We did have, that was an amazing experience with horses galloping up and down the streets and trucks weaving in and out the wickets, so it was quite an unusual experience. Well, a little bit further and stripped off for a dip at Anzac Coast. Ladies, if you'd like to lift your head, you'll notice that that isn't actually a photograph of me. It is actually Adam with that green hat. So that we operate a diverse business in Sassafras, located on the northwest coast of Tasmania. Where am I? Just about there. It's a beautiful district with good red krasnozem volcanic soils, very fertile part of the state of Tasmania. We have a combination of 250 hectares of cropping on the farm. We have potatoes, onions, peas, some grain crops and poppies. A lot of the grain crops are grown for our own feed mill, which we use for feeding to our poultry operation. There's around about 8,000 tonnes of stock feed a year that we process. A lot of that grain is sourced either off our own farm or sourced locally, and so we've become a fairly valuable business for the district in offering some form of diversification and rotation for the cropping farms around us. We also have a series of contract growers now that supply Nichols poultry. That's grown over the last couple of years. We're now up to 7 contract growers that supply the business, but it's still very much a family-operated business. My brother and his family down at Sisters Creek do all of the breeding work and the hatchery for the hatchery work for the business. So I developed an interest in renewable energy around about 4 years ago, actually exactly 4 years ago, when we constructed this wind turbine on our property. And it created significant interest from a number of farmers around the district, and was one of the reasons that I chose to try my hand and apply for the Nuffield Scholarship in the first place. But I wanted to make it a little bit different, and so my study topic was initially going to be biogas and biogas production from poultry waste in particular. Our processing plant, doing about 38,000 chickens a week, produces an awful lot of byproducts from within that processing operation. And we also have additional waste streams or fertility streams coming out of our sheds with poultry manure, and the opportunity for growing alternative crops that we could have fed to a biodigester. So that was the initial interest. However, it changed slightly, and I incorporated other areas as well, which is wind energy, solar, photovoltaic, and also some small-scale hydro in my investigations. I'll talk initially a bit about methane gas production, which I thought was probably going to offer us a great solution to our waste disposal problems within the business. And it was an area that we highlighted in our business as being a weakness, that if we were unable to dispose of our waste products, that we would probably have some difficulties and very costly problems with landfill, that sort of thing. In India, though, a methane digester is a little bit more than what it means to us. In India, it can be the difference between who you marry and who you don't. In this world of fixed, of arranged marriages, apparently it's something that the wife's family will look for in a potential husband. If he has a methane digester, then it means that she can cook dinners nice and easily on the stove. So this little device here is the gas vessel that collects that methane. I don't know if any of you remember watching the cricket when it was played in the UK, and you'd see on the Sunday dinner time, I think it was in Leeds or Manchester or something, where you'd see the large gas vessels that would fill up and float above the grandstands just before dinner, and as everybody turned their ovens on, the vessels would just gradually disappear below the grandstand as the gas was decanted off. This operates in the same way, and you can sort of see this tide mark around here, where the vessel has moved up and down within that vessel. The weights on top just add a little bit of pressure, and the green hose that's coming out there goes down underground and comes up in the house and provides the gas for the cooking. In all of the respects, it's exactly the same as what we would do in the West, but obviously in the West we do it an awful lot bigger. This plant was seen in Denmark, and obviously Denmark has an awful lot of pig production, and they were utilising this for biodigesting pig manures. Even then, they'd had an awful lot of problems. The only odd thing out about this photograph is that 3 megawatt generator there that's generating electricity, burning the gas that's produced from this methane plant, doesn't have a large pile of broken pistons and cylinders and engine components just behind me, but I shouldn't imagine they're too far away. There's an awful lot of problems with these systems that seem to burn out engines left, right and centre. That being said, this particular digester, they did admit to me that at some stage in its life it had closed for 7 months. What happens is the pH can go out of balance, the nutrient microbes within the system will die, and eventually you have to go to the very costly and smelly process of decanting off a large volume of this material and replacing it with active live material that will start the process off again. In most cases, and most biodigesters that I'd seen, at some stage in their life they'd experienced this problem. And a lot of the people operating them were very, very clever scientists who were there quite a lot of the time, more or less on call 24/7, and yet they'd still experience these problems. One of the best sayings I've heard is that it's a cow, not a tractor. And I think we can probably all relate to that one. If it was a tractor, you'd just drive up to it on a Monday morning, turn it on and start producing energy. But it's not, it's a cow. It needs care and attention. And basically you are feeding creatures that are running around, or not running around, but living within the vessel. So it needs to be monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It needs to be fed 365 days a year. And surprise, surprise, a bit like a cow, it doesn't like to eat meat. That might sound a strange statement, but in our application we wanted to use it for using waste meat products and waste byproducts from within our processing plant. There's a possibility of obtaining fish waste from a nearby processing plant as well. But anywhere that you see that, then it can tend to make the operation of it even more difficult than it is. And so the whole idea of it lost a little bit of appeal. Probably one thing that did come to mind at this stage is that it's a secondary form of renewables. And that was probably a bit of a watershed moment for me, and made me realise that the primary sources of renewables, which is wind, solar, photovoltaic, are the ones, mini hydro, they're probably the ones that are the primary harvesting of energy from the sun, rather than a secondary form which is utilising waste materials or growing crops and crop residues specifically for the biodigester. So let me just run through some of the problems with the methane digestion process. And like I say, it's a secondary form of renewable energy, and so you'll always be looking for fuel for the thing, and these things, depending on the size of course, but in most cases can be consuming their way through 50, 60, 70 tonnes of material a day. They're very hungry beasts. One day your fuel will be sought by others. You don't realise it, but everything in there that you might be chucking in as a waste material has a calorific value. It has some of the value that somebody else will cherish more than you do at one stage in the future. One plant that I visited in Scotland had got was in close proximity to 4, he had a small piggery and 4 meat abattoirs and waste and food processing plants within his vicinity. In about 3 years, 3 of those had shut down and stopped supplying him with materials, and he was just left with 1, and the whole operation had shut down as a result of it. So they're very, very fraught with danger. Your fuel might run out, your digester will die, and inexorably you are linked to the price of diesel. So if it's not viable on day 1, it's not going to be viable in 20 years' time either, because as the price of fertiliser increases, as the price of diesel increases, so do all your input costs increase along that same line. Unlike the other forms, the primary forms, where the only cost, your biggest cost, is the one on day 1 when you build it. Having said that, it's worth just pointing out that the German model does seem to work, and in Germany there's 3,500 biodigesters that are chugging away quite merrily. They're fed on a very simple feedstock using grass silage and maize silage, and that seems to be the most reliable. Mostly they are used as an alternative stream for deciding whether or not they would grow cattle or feed that maize silage to their digester. They can play the market. If the cattle market's depressed, then they'll feed the digester. If the cattle market beats the energy costs, then they'll feed it to the stock. So in some ways it offers the farmers some great opportunities and diversification and some great advantages for the farmers to grow alternative crops on their land. On-farm methane production, and this is in the UK and Dorset, just to see how reasonably simple the process is that you just have a large vessel here where you shovel in all your material. In this case it was using some poultry manures, some cattle manures and some silage production. It then gets augered along up the pipe and into the digester where it sits there heated and bubbling away quite merrily. This particular operation here had its history of problems as well. Engine components all over the place, and unfortunately they'd even had one operator that had been killed by inhaling some of the gas too, so it isn't to be trifled with.
Did they stick him into that tub? It doesn't even leave.
I think the fire brigade and workplace standards got there before him. But there are the 5 secrets to success is that there's a reliable and consistent influent, and the influent being the waste stream or the product stream that you're going to put in there. You need to know what it is from day one, and it needs to be the same 20 years' time. You need a high price for your energy, and you can't guarantee that you're going to get that. You need to have a local use for your effluent, the waste material that comes out of it. It still has within it most of the nutrients are within there, and the nitrogen has been lost basically. But it's a fairly bulky item and low nutrient value, and so you need to be within, one person told me, around about a 5 kilometre radius of the plant to be able to use it. Heat is around about 50% of the energy that comes off these things, so you do actually need to have a good local heat source, a use for that heat. The trick on top would be the use of carbon dioxide, and so I just chucked that one in because it could have applications in the vicinity of greenhouses, that sort of thing, where they can utilise the CO2 as well. This is how not to heat a modern city, and I'm talking now because of the fact that these digesters use around about 50% of the energy coming out of them is coming out as heat energy. If you look at this city here near Nottingham, then you can see a large plume of steam rising from those evaporation chimneys that are there. And they're used to basically recycle the steam that's being used as a waste product from the generation of electricity. This particular day it was -5 or something, and the whole of Nottingham was presumably turning up their heaters, and so all they were doing here was burning more coal, and the heat was being lost to the atmosphere instead of being utilised. If that had been in Denmark, then it would have been connected to a district heating system, and on one occasion I saw a place where 20 miles out of town, a city that had 70,000 people in it, they had all the hot water from that plant was being pumped into the city and utilised to heat right the way through. And just about every town in the Danish and Scandinavian countries has its own district heating system, pumping hot water around them to warm the houses. It becomes possible because in Denmark they made it compulsory to connect to these district heating systems, and that's been a very good thing. If you could prove that you can produce your heat for a cheaper price than buying it out of the system, you can opt out of it because you have to go to extreme trouble with significant amounts of insulation and triple insulating your windows, that sort of thing. But basically it's a way of utilising the waste heat, and from a poultry industry perspective it's also a very interesting opportunity that could be utilised to heat buildings and poultry sheds and intensive livestock sheds. Mini hydro offers some great opportunities really. I think Australia, we've probably seen the major hydro schemes around, and I for one only have associated them with being the large dam walls and the traditional Pelton style generator at the bottom of it. The mini hydro schemes work on what's called a fairly low head and what's called the flow of the river. And here you can see that there is, here you see that there's just a small levee bank there that's been built up to create a bit of a weir, and the water is then diverted through this channel here to drive a small turbine that produces electricity. The one lovely thing about hydro is that it's extremely predictable and very easy to calculate. Unlike wind, that is a very variable resource, hydro is very simple to calculate because all you need to know is the head in metres, flow rate in cubic metres of water, the acceleration, which is a constant at 9.81, and the efficiency of the system, which is usually around about 75%. Multiply all of those four figures together and you'll get to determine how many kilowatts of energy you're going to produce. And generally speaking, if you're on a good, reliable river stream, then you're going to be producing it for 8,760 hours a year, which is the amount of time in a year. Unlike wind, where you have a variable resource, so hydro certainly does offer some of those. It only has a low head requirement, so it's not as in a flow of the river situation, it is a possibility to be able to utilise it. And it has a low environmental impact, so these things are considered to be fish friendly. It's basically an Archimedes screw principle, like a giant grain auger. Here's one being manufactured in a facility. Fish are said to be able to swim both up them and down them. That's probably about as large as they come now at 250 kilowatts. Solar electric, I didn't go into that very much, to be quite honest with you. I felt that solar electric, most towns around Australia have somebody in there that's marketing solar and can tell you more about it than I'll be able to. So apart from it being a very similar technology, a similar installation system to what we've experienced with our wind turbine, as in generating electricity to offset your electrical consumption, then that's about as far as we took it. However, it does offer viability for farmers, and this is where it's sort of my whole scholarship changed slightly from looking at the biodigestion principle and then starting to look at what these opportunities were for farmers to embrace renewable energy. It offers an alternative income stream, which in the UK and in Europe seems to be an extremely easy thing for farmers to do. Most people have a field somewhere that allows weekend warriors to traipse around with their motorbikes, or one of their sheds has been converted into a garage to allow them to rent out for some activity. In Australia, we don't seem to have that opportunity, and that's where I felt that renewable energy does offer us an alternative income stream. It utilises, particularly in solar's case, it utilises some existing shed space that we might already have, the low environmental impact, and it offers us that diversification, as I just mentioned. Probably one example that we saw in France, and this was on the Global Focus programme, is that the Rockford cheese supplier here had a set of solar panels installed on its roof, 135 kilowatts, and those panels had now provided this gentleman with an additional income of 160,000 Australian dollars per year for absolutely no work and no maintenance. It was just a simple looking after, servicing a reasonably small debt that he had to continue to do. So it certainly has enabled that farm to be able to continue that traditional pursuit. But wind energy, I suppose, is something that I was fairly keen to look at. I like the opportunities in Aberdeenshire. I felt that Aberdeenshire offered some great similarities to Tasmania. It's said to be geographically isolated like Tasmania, although I don't know quite whether they understand the term geographically isolated when they consider what we're like. And I urge you to download a document on the internet called The Economic Benefits of Small Clusters of Wind Turbines Within Aberdeenshire. You'd be about the third person in the world to read it after myself and the person who wrote it. It was an interesting document, and it did offer some insight as to how farmers can benefit from getting involved in renewable energy. Before I start on this one though, so don't be confused with the utility scale wind farms, and this is the one that's in Tasmania at Woolnorth on the far northwest coast. The utility scale is the scale that transmits its electricity through the high transmission network. What I'm talking about is embedded generation. Yeah, and don't let's get put off by offshore generation facilities either. I did want to go and see one, but this was actually the one at Legoland in the middle. Nobody would allow me, so that was the closest I could get, unfortunately. But embedded generation is the generation that I've become quite passionate about, and this differs from utility scale in that the generators are connected to the local distribution network, and so that is your normal 22,000 volt distribution network that runs around most country lanes throughout Australia. And if you have some of those around, then you do have the facility to be able to do embedded generation. And by definition, that does alters the way that industry can be done, because there's a limit to how much electricity you can pump into some of those lines, and it does limit it to a fairly small-scale operation. And I think this is where we as farmers have this opportunity to capitalise on this, because we can differentiate between utility scale and embedded, and we could make something as a rural industry out of the embedded generation system. Sorry, I should talk about that slide a little bit more. This was against a vegetable packing plant in not far out of Aberdeen. They were producing vegetables for the whole of the UK supermarket chain. And this 2.3 megawatt turbine was powering about 50% of the electricity requirements for that processing operation. And the farmer that owns it had been able to borrow 90% of the capital against only the value of the asset, so the banks were very supportive of these things. And he claimed that the turbine now was generating sufficient alternative income to help pay for all of the debts that he has within the business. So it gave him security that if they had a crop failure or something like that, that at least he could meet his finance requirements. Mackey's Ice Cream was a fantastic stalwart for the whole industry. Here he has, Mirabelle and Matilda, which are his 3 turbines here, presumably named after his 3 daughters. They're connected to his ice cream plant just here, and have been generating for some years now. If you look at this graph, it shows you, the blue line shows you the electricity on the far left-hand side there that was consumed by the business before he put in a wind turbine. When he puts the wind turbines in, the blue then drops right off. That indicates what he's having to purchase when the wind isn't blowing. The yellow indicates the electricity that was generated and consumed on the business that he didn't have to buy, basically. And the green represents the electricity that was produced and sold to the grid. So not only has he just about removed his electricity bill, but he's also now getting a very handy check coming in from the process. Yes, I have to admit, and Paul alluded to this one earlier with his speech, that these systems really do require some fairly generous incentives to make them work. And so this is how a feed-in tariff works in Europe. If you look at a compliant system, if it has a feed-in tariff of 23 pence, it basically means that at that point there, if that's all you did with it and you plugged it into an electric heater and left that in the middle of the paddock, you would still get paid 23.5 pence, 25.3 pence, for generating that electricity, even though it had absolutely no use to society whatsoever. But if you then sell that electricity to the grid, then you can get an additional 3 pence, so you've got 28 pence of income. Or if you offset your consumption in the way that we just saw on that graph for Mackey's Ice Cream, then you have the ability to have around about 37 pence of income. So it's an extremely generous feed-in tariff. That 37 pence is what, just a bit over 50 Australian cents. If you get the incentives wrong, then the temptation is to aim a little bit too small. This particular one was taken in a valley in Yorkshire. It was photographed in the bottom of the valley behind a grain store and had been operating at only 1.5% of its rated capacity. A turbine in a well-sited situation should be doing 30, 40, 45%. But the only reason that one was built there was because there was a government incentive to build the thing. It didn't actually have to produce electricity, and that's where these incentives go horribly wrong. The Holy Grail of renewable energy seems to be at Dardasheim in East Germany. And over there's 135 megawatts of community-owned wind farms that are positioned behind the township of Dardasheim. There's 100 megawatts of photovoltaic installations within the whole town itself. There's a biomethane production facility right within the community, and a lot of the electricity that is generated on some of the rooftops is channeled into some community-owned cars to allow them to charge the cars and use them for the community to drive in and out of towns. Where have I gone? Wrong way. So this is a picture of the piggeries that are installed with solar panels in Dardasheim in East Germany. The community-owned wind farms are behind this township, and they've encouraged people to buy into them to have ownership of them. In Denmark and places like that, it's common that wind farms require that the community invests in those wind farms at around up to 20% of the cost of the installation is offered to communities to buy into those wind farms. So that's allowing people to have an interest in it and placating some of the negatives that seem to be thrown at the whole industry. This is the shot of the town hall in the middle of Derbyshire, and those vehicles that you can see in front are parked there for the community's benefit. And the long-term future of renewables, I'm assured, is that there will be electric cars that are not just there to charge the vehicles, but also to offer some of the base load that is used, that is often talked about as being needed in a system to take out the peaks and troughs. They're talking about having cars on an intelligent metering system that allow the energy that's stored in a stationary car to be taken out of those batteries and used to support the grid at times of high power usage, and then recharged at off-peak times during the night, that sort of thing. So the whole concept of electricity is going to change as a result of all of this. In Derbyshire, they're fanatical about it, and the mayor over there says that it's like we're all rowing in the same boat. And I think he was referring there to the fact that they've got their whole community now is understanding how to be efficient with their use of it, not just on farms, but within houses as well. He's also saying that it's stopping the slide of younger generations to the cities and towns, and so there's a lot of skilling of these renewable energy projects and the servicing and maintenance of them that is being done within communities. A lot of the work in Scotland has proven that wind turbines that are owned by farmers produce around about 2.5 jobs for every turbine that is structured, whereas the utility scale turbines are only generating around about 1/4 of a job per turbine. Now, that's not to say that the ones on farms require more work, it's just that the money that is flowing through the farmers is flowing back into those communities and revitalising them and allowing them to spend that money and on things that they probably otherwise wouldn't do. So alternative energy is an alternative farm income. Do farmers hold the key to a renewable energy future? I think it's a primary industry and we're primary producers, I think that we do. Could this new industry offer some vitally needed opportunities for our beleaguered rural sector? I think the chance to have some diversification would be a great thing. And can we at last offer an exciting future for the next generation? It's considered to be a sexy industry and people want to get involved in it, and young people want to stay in communities where they have renewable energy. So I see it as being a great asset. But first we need to fix a few things, I believe. Farmer lobby groups should really be including renewables in their thinking. I do believe that it's a primary industry activity, and therefore primary industry lobby groups should be talking about it. Incentives like the feed-in tariffs that we see in Europe are not politically palatable over here. And so I think that such things as the accelerated depreciation allowance that we see for irrigation, 75B, if something like that were to allow accelerated depreciation over 3 years, firstly it would be then only available to professional farmers. It would allow rural industries to access that accelerated depreciation. Don't forget my little definition about embedded and utility. If we do it like that, then we're going to see that development occurring in rural areas. And we do really need to do something about the planning and contract negotiation side of things. There's nothing more daunting than knocking on the door of some of the electricity retailers and trying to get them to negotiate a power purchase agreement or a power connection agreement. If farmer lobby groups are able to collectively negotiate those on behalf of farmers, then maybe a few other people would get interested in it. Thanks again to my sponsors, to Riddick and to Nuffield Australia for giving me this great opportunity. And thanks to Joe for pointing me in the right direction and getting me to go on to this scholarship. And particular thanks to Mum and Dad for making me think outside the square. Thank you.
Any questions, Rob?
Rob, what's the feed-in tariff like in Australia
It varies throughout the whole states, and I didn't get into studying it in Australia. In Tasmania, we don't have one. In Tasmania, you have to negotiate a wholesale rate, and that's as good as you're going to get. There are feed-in tariffs in New South Wales. I've heard 60 cents is being floated about as a solar one or something. Every state is different, yeah. But we certainly don't favour it too well in Tasmania, and forgive my bias towards wind, but wind is obviously one of the biggest resources that we have available to us, one of the best resources we have available to us in Tasmania. So that's why most of my presentation revolved around wind.
Incidentally, the South Australian one was 54 cents guaranteed. Right. You had a picture there of France on the solar system, and you mentioned the amount of income per year for the farmer. You didn't mention the capital cost of that. Did you do a capital return calculation on?
I think it was 500,000 euros from memory, so about $700,000, and he gets a return. Rob, you were there too, weren't you? What was it? I think he had a return on investment. It was around about a 6 or 7 year payback.
Which is a bit similar to Australia,
Yeah.
the 60 cent
Yeah.
in New South Wales.
Yeah, but this is on big scale. I mean, 100, I don't know whether there's a limit to the scale that you can put in New South Wales, but 135.
10 kilowatt, but it's similar, it's still saying
There's
similar.
a 135 kilowatt scale here was a massive. Most of them do have a top limit, whereas in Europe they don't seem to. They got rid of that top limit. You can put as big as you like it.
Yeah, it's certainly limited in South Australia to what you can put back into it.
Yeah, yeah.
Richard?
In Australia, there's some quite vocal lobby groups about some perceived adverse health effects of wind turbines. Does that exist anywhere else in the world?
They are the opposition exists else in the world. I wasn't able to find any evidence of health problems associated with low frequency noise, that sort of thing, presumably is what you're referring to. One of the things that helps the model that I'm suggesting that should be adopted in Australia is that embedded generation usually means in that medium scale, not the large scale, and the speed of the rotor determines whether you get low frequency noise coming off or not. It's the speed at which the blade goes past the turbine and the woof, 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 rather than a smaller diameter blade, which is a more medium scale one, which would be a higher pitch. And those noises travel different distances and create potentially perceived issues. But there are some regulations in Victoria now that are stopping wind farm developments over very large distances, and it's stopped the whole industry.
Rob here, sorry I couldn't help you. I was thinking about the use of sheds. I thought you might mention the Sarah had use for her shed.
Oh, yeah, well, there you go. There's another perfect example of of how people can diversify. When we were in France, one of Sarah, who was in our year, was our host for the French part of the trip, and one of the old barns had been converted into a disco, and she had within the building a little bus that was the cubicle for all the electronic gizzardry. And she'd got a dance floor and bar and you name it, big lights on the roof and spotlights and everything. So the amazing amount of opportunities for diversification.
In the embedded system, especially in industrial areas such as the poultry plant, does that eliminate the need for batteries in between to help with the power, or you can just switch from the embedded system to the network once you like?
With an embedded system similar to what we've done on our property, you are still totally reliant on the grid. You can never disconnect yourself from the grid, and basically it's like a negative motor that is connected to your factory. When the wind turbine is generating electricity, you're just not using as much in your plant. If you're producing more than you need, then it exports back into the grid. Electricity has to have somewhere to go every 2 seconds. You have to have used up what you put in and use and produce what you need at that point. It's every 2 seconds, bang, 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 bang. And so you can't actually store anything within the grid. And as a small unit, it's impossible to regulate that, and that's why you connect to the grid and use that as the buffer and the battery for your surplus power.
Nice question, Tim. You can argue the exact number of years, but I've heard said that a big wind turbine has to be spinning for about 20 years to actually offset the amount of carbon used to build the whole structure. Is wind turbines really the solution?
I was told that it's only a year and a half to 2 years, so that's... and I don't know as it is. I think maybe as a society we're going to look back at this in 100 years' time and say, what the heck were we playing around with wind turbines for? But at the moment, they are the cheapest form of renewable energy resource and the most known and well-documented source of renewable energy that's out there, apart possibly from hydro. Hydro is without doubt best, but wind energy seems to be the one that holds the greatest key at the moment.
I wonder if the difference on the carbon repayment is the difference between the price of carbon in Europe and the price of carbon in Europe.
Don't forget that just about everything in a wind turbine can be recycled at later in time. It's only steel and copper, basically.
Thank you.